Welcome back. Well, it's Holocaust Memorial Day on Friday, and I'm joined by Wendy Holden now, who's author of this extraordinary book, Born Survivors, which is about the story of 3 Holocaust survivors, including, I'm delighted to say, Eva Clarke, who joins me now. Now, just very briefly, ladies, I brought you in because you gave a talk at my daughter's school, and she said it was the best talk she'd ever given. It was hugely inspirational, and therefore I wanted to ask you about it directly on this sofa. Eva, your story, I mean, you shouldn't really be here. Encapsulate your story for us, if you can, in the short time available.
Right. My father was German, my mother was Czech. They met in Prague. They were young, able to work, and so they were amongst the first people to be sent to Theresienstadt, the first camp in Czechoslovakia. They were there for 3 years, which was a very unusually long period of time, and then my father was sent to Auschwitz, and incredibly my mother actually volunteered to follow him the very next day because she had no idea where he'd been sent. So being the eternal optimist, she thought they would survive, but she never ever saw my father again. And she found out after the war that he had been shot on the death march on the 18th of January 1945, and Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th.
So just days before?
Yes, yes, yeah. My mother became pregnant in Terezin, which was illegal. The sexes were segregated. And she said, well, it happened. And it happened twice. It was very dangerous, but it happened twice. And when she was pregnant with my brother, and the Germans found out, they said that when the baby was born, he or she would have to be handed over to be killed.
By the Gestapo, obviously.
Yeah. When he was born in February of 1944, his name was Jiří, which means George, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death saved my life and my mother's life, because had she arrived in Auschwitz holding my brother in her arms, they would have both been killed. And then she arrived in Auschwitz later, and she was pregnant again with me, but nobody knew. She knew, but nobody else knew, and it didn't show. So again, she lived to see another day. So she managed to disguise the pregnancy for the entire time, and then the circumstances of your birth. Yes. My mother was in a slave labour camp for 6 months in Germany, and then they were evacuated to, they were on a train that consisted of coal wagons for 17 days with no food, no water. And at the end of those 17 days, they arrived in a place called Mauthausen, which is in Austria near Linz. And when my mother saw the name at the station, she had such a shock, because as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz not knowing what that was, this time she knew. And she said the shock was so great that she always thought that it possibly provoked the onset of labour. And she gave birth to me on a cart in the open air. And
without any help at all?
Oh, none. Help. There was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming. Presumably she had been. And she always said she was screaming not only because she was in labour, but because she thought she was about to die. But we both survived the experience. I was born, I didn't move, I didn't breathe. And we always say that there are 3 reasons why we survived, and the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas for the gas chamber. Well, my birthday is 29th.
Goodness
so
me.
Presumably had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, I wouldn't be talking to you now. The second indirect reason why we survived is because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide.
Yes.
And the last and the best reason why we survived was because on the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckons she wouldn't have lasted much longer. They think I weighed 3 pounds. I was wrapped in paper.
And presumably your mother as well was very undernourished. I
think
she weighed 5 stone, even though she was pregnant.
Yeah.
Wendy, let me bring you in, because it's not just Eva's story that you've managed to capture in this astonishing book. There are 2 other born survivors.
Yes.
And you managed to track them down and then unite them. How on earth did you do that?
Well, I first came across the story in 2013 when I read an obituary of a woman who had died in Canada in her 80s, who'd had a baby that had been taken away and murdered. And it got me thinking, have any babies survived the Holocaust? And after a fair amount of research, I came across Eva's name. And when I read about her and her mother, I would have travelled to Australia to see them.
Yes.
But she lives in Cambridge, and I live in Suffolk, so it was perfect. And I spent the day with her. It was incredibly moving. And at the end of the day, I asked if she would do me the great privilege of writing her mother's story. And she reached out and touched my arm and said, "I've been waiting for you for 70 years. And I told her I believed her story was unique, and it was quite funny because she was a little indignant. She goes, well, I thought so too, but 5 years ago I discovered that there were two others whose mothers had been on the self-same journey, from Auschwitz to slave labour to Mauthausen, and they had been reunited through the reunion of the American veterans who liberated them.
And then you managed to reunite them with
Well,
Eva.
they had met, and then we managed to get together. Once I knew about them, I realised I had to encompass all three, because I call them siblings of the heart. They've become so close, and I couldn't miss one without the other.
And how did it feel to meet those people who had been in exactly the same situation you, and basically been born in these extraordinarily difficult circumstances and survived it?
Right, well, I have to take all the credit because I found them.
Fair play.
I found them 5 years before by chance via the American Veterans Organisation. It's a long story.
Yes.
And so we met 5 years before in Mauthausen, when it was the last time that the American veterans were going there, because they were very elderly by that stage. And it was quite remarkable. We sat in one cafe all day, talking about our mothers, laughing and crying and talking about them. And I was so glad that they both came to Cambridge the following year in 2011, and they met my mother, who was the only one of the three mothers who was still alive.
Amazing.
And they were so pleased to meet her. And because we all happen to be only children, so we feel we are siblings. And they came into our house, and my mother, because my mother was living with us then, and my mother said, "You're my children."
That is lovely. I mean, a happy ending to such a difficult situation. Just ask you briefly before we finish, Eva, with regard to Holocaust Memorial Day on Friday, there does seem to have been a resurgence of anti-Semitism, not just in Britain but around the world. Briefly, do you think enough is being done to educate school children and people about the importance of the Holocaust, but also to try and expel what remains to be anti-Jew sentiment?
That's a very big question.
I know.
It is very sad that there is this resurgence, and I think, yes, we all have a responsibility to try to educate as many young people as possible to show what is, in quotes, the logical outcome of racism and prejudice.
Well, I think the phrase that we always use when it comes to Holocaust Memorial Day is never forget. And this extraordinary story, just to say the book again, is called Born Survivor. Wendy and Eva, what a story you've had to tell, and thank you so much for joining us here on the show this morning.